Okay, the Germantown School District calling to order the Teaching and Learning Committee meeting. We'll start with roll call. Tracy Pollock.
Here.
Brian Medved.
Here.
Kim Higginbotham here. Item 3, agenda revisions and approval.
Move to approve the agenda.
Second.
Okay, Tracy with the motion, Medved with the second. Any discussion? Motion carries.
Nope, we gotta vote.
What up?
We gotta vote.
Oh, I'll decide. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, motion carries. All right, and then we have item 4, approval of minutes.
Move to approve the April 8th, 2024 committee meeting minutes.
Second.
Okay, I have Tracy with the motion, I have Brian with the second. Any discussion? No? All right, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, item 5, reports and updates, we have none. 6, unfinished business, we have none. Okay, item 7A, we have middle school reading pilot update and resource recommendation. Jake?
You thought you were done with reading updates.
But yet, here we go.
I know, I was like, teed it up. And we've kind of spotlighted the elementary process in this, but the whole time we've been running a middle school review along the way, and I provided updates regarding the middle school pilot and their process. We've collected data from our middle school team on their resources, and I will walk you through the process that the middle school took. It is very similar to the same process that we did at the elementary level. There are a couple of differences, and part of that's because of just the number of teachers who were involved in the pilot as to why those adjustments were made. So I'll walk you through the process and what we did for the last 2 years. So first of all, again, just like the elementary pilot, this work couldn't have been done without the teachers who were involved in this. So we have Kristen Hill Schaefer, Heidi Foyt, Catherine Greg Ware, Beth Wade, Luke Lavacek, Beth Butner, Tom Wilcox, and Sam Midlakowski, who all participated either in the reading review team or as pilot teachers. And this review, similar to the elementary review, started back last year. And we went through a similar process where we brought that team of teachers together, and we really looked at the current state of what was going on at the middle school, and then we talked about what the desired state would be. That team of teachers identified the inconsistencies that they saw across grade levels. So similar to what we saw at elementary, where we had inconsistencies across buildings, here we had inconsistencies across grade levels, where they wanted it to be a little bit tighter in terms of the units that they were using in each of those classrooms. In addition, one of the things that they were looking for, where they were still looking for prioritization of making sure that we had text in students' hands, that students were reading high quality text frequently, that they still were able to discuss and analyze text deeply, as well as have access to nonfiction and fiction texts. They also wanted to make sure that there was a balance between text that was current and some of the more classical pieces of literature, that students still had access to both of those. Similar to the elementary review, we reached out to a number of vendors. We didn't use just what we had looked at the elementary level, so that wasn't guardrails that were put on the team. So they were able to look at any of the resources that were available that met the criteria we were looking for. There are less vendors to look at the middle school level than the elementary level, so their choices from the get-go were a little bit more limited than what elementary had available to them. But they arrived at extensions of 2 of the programs that we were looking at the elementary level. So at the elementary level, we looked at HMH into reading. In middle school, it's called HMH into literature. And then Wonders is the McGraw-Hill product that we approved last month, and the extension of that's McGraw-Hill's StudySync. Again, as we had this discussion at the Teaching and Learning Committee, we looked at each one of those grade bands separately, so it was not a priority of the team to say we must have what the elementary is doing and it has to be an extension of what the elementary is doing. Really what we were looking for was the best resource for middle school students. So that wasn't one of the requirements that they were looking for, was it had to be an extension of what elementary came up with. We were really looking at what the best resource for that team was. In January, we dove deeper into best practices in terms of those instructional resources and used those best practices to evaluate what we had from the vendors. So things that they were looking for were they were looking for high quality texts. They want to make sure that middle school engagement with text is high, because they know that if you've got the best books in the world but the kids aren't reading them, that's going to be a struggle. One way to increase student engagement and increase the desirability is to put high quality text in students' hands, stories that they're interested in, things that they can connect to. And that was one of the priorities they were looking for. They identified that the resource has to focus on the prioritized standards and hold a high amount of rigor, so it had to be challenging. They were looking, similar to the elementary, for a balance of fiction and nonfiction texts that were included. The curriculum had to be anchored in effective instructional practices. They were looking for a high degree of usability because they want consistency in implementation. They were also looking for opportunities for differentiation. So they wanted to make sure that there was an ability for us to meet the needs of all the learners that were in our classrooms. So if there were students who were coming in that struggled, that there would be ways that those students could access grade level text, as well as if there were students who were doing very well, that they could have an opportunity for extensions. And then lastly, they were looking for high quality assessments that were embedded along in the resource. In the spring, we analyzed those different resources and landed on 2. So we were looking at McGraw-Hill's StudySync and then HMH's Into Literature. So then we developed our proposed pilot plan that was very similar to what we proposed at the elementary level. And then in the summer of '23, we had the positive recommendation to pilot StudySync and Into Literature. In the fall and in the winter of '23, teachers were provided their initial training on the resource. One of the reasons why the training was staggered like that was because at the middle school level we did a stacked pilot, which we had talked about previously at a Teaching and Learning Committee, and the difference between what we did at the elementary level and at the middle school level was, at the middle school level, all teachers, most of the teachers piloted both of the programs. So that's different than what we did at the elementary level. So at the elementary level, one of the things that we were concerned with was if a student used a resource for a particular amount of time and then we switched it on them, that would create inconsistency for our young reading learners. At the middle school, both of these programs are built on units. So you can take a unit and you can almost interchange them a little bit easier, and the students don't quite get the same level of whiplash that they get at the elementary level, where you might be changing an entire instructional approach for them. So that was one of the reasons why we were okay with a stacked pilot. The other piece of that was it was really due to staffing at the middle school. We've talked about challenges of pilots several times, and that it's difficult if you're a teacher and you're by yourself and you're piloting something alone. At the middle school, we had new teachers who were being brought up on staff, and then those teachers were also using the pilot resources. So to build consistency for them so that they were able to plan together, so that that group of teachers could support one another, we had those teachers use the same units. This also provided an opportunity for the members of our reading review team to get their eyes deeply on both of those resources. So the members of our review team who had been there since the inception, they were able to pilot both of them so that our veteran teachers could have eyes on both of the resources and make the determination about which one of those works best for kids. This year they've piloted those resources and they've piloted units from both of those resources. They've looked at both the nonfiction and fiction units within those resources because they wanted to see how well those resources performed with students, so that they purposely picked units that they thought would be engaging for kids, so that they were trying those units under essentially the best possible conditions for students, so that they were interesting for the kids, that they could try them out, and then they could measure the student engagement as well as how well did the students do in terms of understanding the material and on the assessments that were provided by the curricular resource. In the spring of '23, we debriefed each one of those resources. Teachers accepted feedback from students all along the way in terms of, you know, how well they liked the stories, what did they think of the questions that they were being asked, the overall structure. These resources have an online component and we're one-to-one at the middle school, so how well does the technology integrate with it? There's an opportunity for students to digitally annotate both texts, so they can mark up the texts online and they can point out, here's what I'm learning while I'm reading about this particular topic, and they can record all that online. So they looked at the functionality of those two platforms and they asked students about that. So they collected a lot of information both from their end and then also from the students and how well they performed. And now we've gotten to the spot where it's the May of '24 and we're ready to make a recommendation in terms of which one of these resources we think will work best for Kennedy Middle School. Dr. Rurr, can you switch to the table first? So the following table was included in the board packet, and this is, again, an average of all of our teachers' scores on each one of these prioritized areas. One of the things that was slightly different between the middle school and elementary process was we spent a little bit more time debriefing each one of the rubric categories so that when teachers rated those, there was a clear expectation. We did, for each one of these, there's a number of bullet points that describe what we're looking for in that category. In the first pass that we did with elementary teachers, they felt that they were comfortable using that rubric. And then on the second pass, when they were applying it, they said they had some questions about how they might rate those. So we tried to eliminate part of that when we were working with the middle school team. So you can see that for the majority of the categories, the product by McGraw-Hill Study Sync is significantly outperforming HMH's into reading. There are some categories where they're very, very close, where one may receive a 3.2 and the other one's a 3.25. So in all the areas where HMH was or did exceed McGraw-Hill, it was by fractions of points. But in other critical areas, you can notice that Study Sync really does outperform HMH's into literature. So when we were talking about the organization of the student materials, students getting frustrated by the organization. From HMH, what they were struggling with was the online platform didn't necessarily match the physical resource that they had. In terms of the integration with technology, you'll see that HMH scored very low there. One of the things that they struggled with was there's an opportunity for students to record things online, and it's just the functionality of it, where students would often lose some of the work that they had. So students went through and they did what they were supposed to the first time, and then when they logged back in to use it, it was gone, which for a middle school kid can be very frustrating, and then that's a quick way to disengage them from using the product.
Just
so
for just a middle school student, that's frustrating.
Sometimes adults are able to regulate their emotions slightly better than a middle school kid. So they show it a little bit more clearly to everybody else when their work is gone. In addition, they thought the support for teachers, which has been a big thing for us as we're looking for this when we talk about consistency of implementation. They thought the support for teachers was better within McGraw-Hill. And then one of the biggest things that I thought I heard from teachers' comments when you look at differentiation and accessibility, as well as rigor and depth, we had a really good conversation about both of those areas, and Study Sync and its ability to reach a range of learners. When I show you the highlights of Study Sync and some of the things that it has to offer, the the ability for it to support students reading grade level text, our teachers appreciated, but then in terms of rigor and depth, you know, they have been working on some sample items for the forward exam, and our teachers were talking about how challenging some of the questions were for StudySync, and at the same time, they also made the connection, yeah, but they're very similar to what our students are being asked to do on the forward exam. So they saw the level of questioning that the students were being asked to do, and they noticed that it's aligned to the same level of questions that they're being asked on the forward, and the forward's aligned to our state standards. So the quality and the rigor that StudySync offers to our students, our teachers appreciate. And any questions about the rubric scores? All right. So when it comes to StudySync, you'll notice this slide from before. So again, even though it wasn't a priority, one of the things that is going to be a benefit for StudySync at the middle school is you're going to notice that there's a similarity in instructional framework. So what they're experiencing K-5 and Wonders carries forward 6-8 into the middle school. So one of the things that StudySync is built on is this gradual release of responsibility, and what that means is there's quality explicit instruction that students are receiving whole group. The teacher models a skill, and then the students are able to do that independently as they're reading. So there is this release of responsibility. The kids aren't just expected to go off and do it on their own. The teacher provides that explicit instruction first, and then students are given an opportunity to practice that. And then students are also able to work in small groups around high-level discussion questions. In addition, you're going to notice that this is aligned with some of the priorities from the district. So StudySync, given that it's a McGraw-Hill product and an extension of Wonders, you're going to see this format to it that's grounded in understanding by design. So each one of the 6 instructional units that is at each grade level is united by a single theme or an essential question. So students are always going back to this essential question, which is one of the design models that we use across all of our content areas in Germantown. In addition, this gives students an opportunity to explore an idea in detail. Each one of those 6 units has multiple texts that are involved in it, and those texts are then linked to that question. So they're able to read multiple stories. All of those stories are working in exactly the same direction. So a sample day of StudySync, what this looks like at the middle school level, it starts off with the launch of a lesson. There's something called a blast that is often used. Our teachers talked about that's just an engaging way for students to start thinking about the topic or the idea that they're going to dig into. It offers them an opportunity to build some background knowledge together, which is one of those skills that we were looking for at the elementary level. We know that as background knowledge of a concept or topic increases, a student's ability to read complex text also increases. Then a teacher would model a skill. For example, they would analyze vocabulary that's in the reading that they're going to do, or they might show students a comprehension strategy that they're going to use during a close reading, and then they would release students to go ahead and do that on their own. Following that reading, students are going to discuss that text and respond to some discussion questions, and I've got some examples of those coming up. So as I said before, one of the things that teachers noticed about StudySync that they thought that they were very, very pleased with was its ability to differentiate support, and then for our English language learners, it also has that level of support. One of the things that it does is it doesn't give students different texts. So there aren't like 30 different things that students are reading. Students are reading the same text. But what it has is it, on the digital side, has scaffolds that can be pulled in for students so that it helps them understand the text that they're reading, and that can be scaled for students. So the students who might struggle to read that text first time, it's called an approaching level support, They can pull that in and it'll ask them some scaffolding questions, tell them things to look for, help them decoding particular words by talking about prefixes or suffixes that are in a word, so it can help them understand that text. So those scaffolds can be brought in so that students are all reading the same thing and not a variety of texts. In addition, the same thing with EL. There are lessons that are specifically targeted for our English language learners so that that can support them as they build their language acquisition. As we talked about in Wonders, there are some key routines that are built into the program, and the cornerstone of StudySync is something called close reading. One of the things, especially for middle school students, that's hard to understand is every once in a while you have to read a text more than once to understand it. So this program forces students to read text sometimes more than once. And the reason it does that is because that first read, we fly through it. Sometimes we're enjoying it so much we don't notice everything that's going on in it, or we fly through it and we get to the end and we don't even know what we read. So as students are working with some of these passages, they're given different things to do as they're reading through it. So the first time they read through it, they might be just saying, what does this text, what's the message of it, what's going on? The second time through it, they might be asked to look at a skill. So they might be asked to say, okay, well, how does the author build suspense? So what are the words that they're using that build suspense for the reader? How does it make them feel that way?
Sorry, I was distracted by a noise.
So as they're doing those multiple readings of the text, like I said, they're being asked to do different things along the way. So they might, after that first read, they might in the second read be asked to look at different vocabulary, characteristics of features of the genre, which is linked to the standards that students are looking at. They might also be asked to discuss specific questions with a partner. So it might draw the student back to say, okay, now that you've read it a second time, what are some of the things that you're noticing that the author is doing? Just like Wonders, there's going to be specific lessons that are associated with it. So when we said that the reader would be asked to do something on the second pass through, one of the things that they might be asked to do is to engage in word study. So word study would be teaching them something about the words that they're noticing in the text. So in this case, what they're looking at is examples of prefix and how those prefixes change the meaning of the word. So during the second reading, it's less about what is the text saying, because I already read it one time. Now the second time through, I'm looking at some of those words, and that builds students' capacity to interact with those words in different texts. And just like Wonders, one of the things that our teachers enjoyed about StudySync is it's built on high quality text. So as I said before, here's a classical piece of literature, The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. This is just, it's literally out of the first unit of 8th grade, so I pulled that text for you to see. And what they'll do is they access that text. There are certain things that the teacher is going to highlight and model for the student and point out that the student will notice with that piece of text. So in this one of the things that they're looking for, or that they would highlight, is the point of view. So they're talking about this story is told by the first person. So they're going to discuss how that effect impacts the meaning of the story, or what the author is trying to do by telling that from first person. In addition, it's going to ask the students to look at second sentence structure. So on the second read through, it might ask students to notice, how do those long sentences that are broken down by dashes and capital letters indicate that the narrator's anxious? So go back into the text, find evidence that shows that the narrator is anxious during this point. And then in addition to that, on that second read, they might be asked to look at some specific vocabulary. So when you find this difficult word, what are some strategies that you can use to help you understand what the text is trying to tell you? And then here are some examples of those tasks that the reader is being asked to do. So things that are typical that we would be asking our middle school kids to do, we'd ask them to annotate, find context clue to develop meaning. We're looking at comprehension. StudySync is filled with questions that we're asking to our students to help them understand how well they're understanding the text. We'd be looking at making sure that our students are also engaged in conversations about the text so that they can discuss the meaning and debate what they're learning from the text. And then I gave you an example of what a close reading prompt might look like. So in this example, it says, can the narrator of The Telltale Heart be trusted? Consider the author's word choice, tone, and description of events as you draw conclusions about the narrator's state of mind. Be sure to support your ideas with evidence from the text. So again, we're going back into that text to analyze it. And again, this is an example of an 8th grade task. In StudySync, reading is linked to writing. So all along the way, the writing that the students are doing is connected to that essential question that they're studying all along the way. Writing is used to teach multiple things. So they might be just responding to text questions. So that's the writing that they're doing. They're analyzing the text and they're demonstrating their comprehension. But in addition to that, we might be looking at grammar. So on that previous slide, I was giving you an example of what the author was doing using dashes. So we might be teaching a grammar lesson using dashes so that students understand the function of it. So those lessons aren't taught independently. They're taught in connection with and using text for students to read. Each one of our reading units has an extended writing project. In that extended writing project, students are going to be going through all of the major genres of writing. So they're going to write narrative, they're going to write informational text, they're going to write arguments, and all of those are connected to the readings that they're doing. So they're going to get examples of those types of readings while they're engaging in the writing task that's there. And then for writing, they're going to go through a traditional writing process where they're going to draft, they're going to revise, they're going to get feedback, and then they're going to publish that piece. And that is StudySync. Questions about StudySync?
So I guess first I just want to thank all the teachers and the review team that have done a lot of work in this. They kind of went, I think, a little under the radar because we put so much focus on the pilot for the elementary school. So I appreciate all the time they took to review it, to work with the kids and kind of change back and forth. To be able to do 2 different pilots at the same time is pretty impressive. So we appreciate that, and the feedback that we got from the teachers to help also make a good decision. And this definitely helped to kind of clarify what it all entails. The one question that I do have is that we talked about like the text quality and how important it is because we're trying to develop the readers, which we started with, very impressed with the Wonders already, but to be able to keep the attention on reading, because not all kids enjoy the task to begin with, is it possible to change the text over time to the either different classes, different, new students coming in to keep them engaged in the reading?
Yep. So with StudySync, there are matched or paired readings. Those are the extended ones that they're going to do with a whole novel. Each one of the units is also built on samples of stories. So to keep engagement, they do mix it up on the students. So they won't necessarily read the entire book, but they'll get one snippet of it or an excerpt of it for them to read. So for middle school kids, that change exposes them to a lot of different stories, and that's what the units are built on. The product comes with its paired reading, so here are 3 novels that go with it. But I think Mr. Ewert pointed out when we were talking about teaching reading a while ago that there's lots of different pieces of literature that can be used to teach certain concepts, and that's the same idea. So if there's a particular book that we wanted to change up for that purpose, that we need to mix it up over time, you'd simply be looking for books that are in that same similar genre, and you could move those in, and those are for those extended reads that students are doing. So the longer reads that students are doing, we could tailor that to what we want. In addition, you're not locked into the choices that they have there, so that you have options that are there, but you wouldn't necessarily have to do those. The lessons are built on those, the shorter reads that are a part of that.
Any other questions, comments?
No questions, just a general thanks again. As you pointed out, it's been a long process. I'm sure countless number of hours. So that's, that's very important for us. We all know that at the elementary school level, getting the kids to try to get the proficiency or above proficiency is key. However, it doesn't stop when they move on to the middle school, and trying to keep those kids where they are, improve where they are, and anybody who's close to try to continue moving them forward. So, well, it was mentioned, we had a lot of focus at the elementary school. The fact is that this is also an extremely important piece for us all, for this district, and getting our kids to read and write. So, thanks.
I'll pile on with what they're saying. We do appreciate the process. I think we've become kind of the model for how to do it right. And that is appreciated, that we come up with a system that digs deep and analyzes and gives feedback and input, and it's so important. I think out of all the topics I think in school, for me, this is one of the most important. If you can't read and write, you're kind of going to be lost in society. So, and I think when you throw critical thinking into it, if you can't read and write, you're probably going to struggle there as well. So everything kind of builds on top of being able to read and write. So I appreciate the effort going into this, and I think it sounds to me, looking at the rubric that you went through, we got the right one. So much appreciated.
Just kind of piggybacking off what you were saying, so this allows us the ability to sub in a different text if we're looking to increase engagement from the students, but it allows that framework to still exist.
Correct.
Where we don't start slipping into that curricular drift, where eventually, 4 or 5 years down, we're just way off base of what the original intent was. Is that
Correct. The
safe to
core of
say?
the core of that program, there aren't interchangeable parts. So the core is there, the extended reads. So that's when you go back to what the middle school teachers highlighted as a priority, and I completely agree with them. You could get to the understanding of the standards and skill development that we're looking for just using the core curriculum. The extended reads, students have to engage in high volumes of reading, and that's where that extended read really builds off of this program. So you could just use the core as a standalone, and you're not going to drift, and we're still hitting all the critical components that we're looking for. The extended read is one of those areas where it's almost an extension of, and it helps us build a deeper understanding for the students, because we're asking them to, here, take what you've applied in these short reads, and now we're going to apply it to a long read. So, and that's a function of this group too, when we take a look at the texts that are there, and a function of the group that I've worked with is, when is it time to take a look at that review, and when should we look at updating the texts that are involved with what our students are reading.
That's awesome. I appreciate that it lends that flexibility while still keeping us on rails, so to speak. So, fantastic.
The other question I would have, just like with the other, now that we've, and if this passes, that we go through with a new curriculum, to be able to compare, next year, because that'll be the first full year that we're using that curriculum, to see past years, are we doing better? Are we, to see if there are any adjustments that we need to do, and just so that we're, have some actual data that says we're on the right path.
Yeah, that's something that we'd want to continually monitor. There are different levels of assessments that we'll use in the classroom, so there are ways for us. One of the benefits to a program like this is you have some standard aligned assessments that we can use that are built in, and we have examples and models of what those responses should look like, so it's easier for us to gauge and understand where our students are in relation to those. So there are some classroom level assessments that we can use. The district uses MAP, and that extends to the middle school level, so we'll be able to monitor our students' growth using MAP. And then the last piece of that is Forward. Forward's a little bit challenging in that you're comparing different groups of students. So we can't compare 8th grade this year to 8th grade next year, because it's a different crew of kids. And with a standard curriculum that we're gonna have K-8 now, the idea here is that every year they're gonna be getting better and better, because every year they're gonna have another year of this high quality resource with them. The other twist to Forward is this year Forward has changed its structure, so comparing last year's Forward to next year's Forward is not gonna be an apples to apples comparison for us. But we do have some internal measurements that we can use. MAP is not changing, so we'll still be able to measure a student against themselves. So we'll be able to see how much growth is a student making, and that's really the data that I'm gonna bring to the Teaching and Learning Committee to say, here's how our students are growing with this, because that's not an 8th grade to 8th grade comparison where last year's 8th graders to this year's 8th graders. It's this student at the beginning of the year compared to this student at the end of the year. How much did they grow while they experience this? And that's information that I can provide.
Right, and then I guess that's would be my point, which would be like the growth that we had in past years where we didn't have a curriculum versus the growth that we're seeing in our students in each of the
That's absolutely
grades now
information.
would
Yep.
be beneficial to, I think, all of us, because we're very interested and, again, all the time that everybody put into making this decision, and again, having the teachers and the review team involved, it just gets everybody kind of on board and excited for something, when instead of imposing a curriculum or, or we heard from here that this curriculum works, we took the time to make sure everybody determined this was our best route, so excited to hear the.
I did have one more question.
Sure.
You had mentioned that part of the priority when you were looking at the programs was not to have that easy transition from K-5 through middle school, but I think that's been a concern throughout, that we need to have everybody kind of on the same page, the buildings at the elementary level, the middle school, so that the transition isn't so abrupt going from 5 to 6 or from 8 to 9.
Yep.
There has to be some kind of consistency across the district through the levels.
Absolutely. So it's definitely wonderful to have that Wonders and Study Sync fit well together. When we looked at programs, then it doesn't become the deciding point, because really what we're looking for is a high quality program. So what we said at the K2 level is if we're adopting a reading program that teaches students to read, we're going to be able to transition them to literally anything, and they're still going to be able to read. To your point, absolutely, it does build consistency when you have a common curriculum along the way, and it, in theory, is going to be a huge benefit for our kids. It just wasn't the number one deciding factor that was there. I can tell you from my discussion with teachers, they definitely appreciated the fact that the two that they were piloting were options that were available at the elementary level, and whether we said this is the factor or not, it likely had some bearing on what they were picking, because they'll tell you that's something that they're looking for too, is that when they have 5th graders come up to 6th grade, that there's some consistency in the students' experience in 5th grade for them to build on when they're in 6th grade. It's just, again, if it's a high quality program, it's gonna continue to support our students in their ability to read. The fact that we're gonna have consistency K-8 is just a wonderful add-on.
Yeah, what I feel is, it doesn't have to be the same curriculum going all the way through, you're using the same textbooks, same company, whatever it is. But what we're doing by changing the buildings at the elementary level is that we're preparing everyone for the middle school. And then the middle school is preparing everyone for the high school. And that's kind of the priority, I guess, is that you're prepared for the next level regardless of where you're coming from.
Yep, so that's the big piece, is what our middle school teachers would articulate and our elementary teachers did say is it's that consistency across grade level. You shouldn't be able to go to 6th grade and have a completely different experience than somebody who's in a different house. So at the middle school, if you're a 6th grader, you're a 6th grader at Kennedy, there should be a high degree of consistency in terms of the readings that you're given, the writing projects that you have to do, and the lessons that you're given in your literacy class. So that degree of consistency is something that was very important to our teachers.
And
Appreciate it.
Impacting students too, if there's changes that have to be made in schedules for external reasons, and the three houses are all pulling in the same direction, it's an easier function for that student to switch a house and correct maybe some behavioral issues or whatever it would happen to be. So I think that's an additional add that probably goes a little less discussed here, but is important.
Yep.
With that, I will entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion with a positive recommendation to the Finance Committee to approve the Study Sync resource by McGraw-Hill and the 6-year agreement for an amount not to exceed $150,047.77. The approval of the Study Sync resource shall include all components essential to meeting Wisconsin ELA standards and exclude standalone SEL lessons until an SEL review is conducted to determine the lesson's utility and alignment.
Second.
Tracy with a second, or the motion, Brian with a second. Any discussion? Nope, we're good. All right, well, with that, we'll take a vote. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? That motion carries. Okay, move on to 7B, approval of the Kennedy Middle School schedule.
All right, so I brought a special guest with me tonight to talk about the Kennedy schedule. I've given a couple updates on the process that we've used for the Kennedy Middle schedule, and then also included a review of the process that we've used. I've gone through this review of the process before, but now we're at the point where we're going to make a recommendation about the schedule, so I thought it was important to include that here. When Ms. Guerin took the principal position at Kennedy Middle School, we talked about the fact that she took the time to meet individually with each one of her teachers that wanted to come and talk to her. And there was a big turnout for people who wanted to meet with Jess, and then Jess talked to them about you know, what's going well at Kennedy, what are some of the things that can be improved on, what do I need to know about Kennedy, and in those conversations she heard some similar themes about the schedule, and that's what led us to first forming a scheduling team and then running this team through that process. When Jess met with that group, and then again when we met with that smaller team of teachers, there were some common themes of big things at the middle school that we were looking at adjusting. So one of the themes was that in the middle of the school day, we have 2 periods of time. We have SAS and IDR, and during those 2 periods of time, teachers thought that there might be a better opportunity for students during those periods of time. In addition to that, we have 2 of our core classes, science and social studies, that run at 40 minutes, and then all of our coordinated arts run at 40 minutes. And the discussion was that if those could be extended in any way, that would be a benefit for our students. And then in addition to that, one of the themes that we had from our review was if you were to remove SAS and IDR from the current schedule, there are some benefits to that. So those times do have some strengths. So what are those strengths, and how can we turn that into a positive for our students? Time for them to connect with teachers, time for them to get help with problems that they're struggling with in class, an opportunity to work on homework if they need to, an opportunity for us to embed some of the extra programming that we have within the middle school. So we've talked about this at the teaching and learning level, that there are some things that based on state statute we must do with students. An example of that's like our suicide prevention program. So something that's very valuable, but there just doesn't seem to be a spot for it within the schedule. An advisory period might be an opportunity for us to build that programming in. So there's a built-in time for the day that's not going to take away from the core, that we're able to provide some additional programming for students. So the process that Jess and I used with the middle school review team for the schedule, we talked about the current state of our schedule, and then what some of the strengths were and some of the weaknesses. And from there, the teachers identified what some of their priorities and values were. So priorities and values that they established in that team were that there should be choice and opportunities for students. So this kind of applies to the ability for students to have elective classes, so being able to choose different electives that are interested to them. They wanted to prioritize developing connections with students at the middle school level, and at really any level in education. It's very important for teachers to have a connection with their students. The structure has to be appropriate for middle school kids. There should be common planning time for teams, as we talked about in the pilots. Trying to do something all by yourself is difficult, so making sure that there are time within the schedule for teachers to meet so that they can collaborate and lesson plan together was an important piece. And then additionally, there should be an opportunity to provide academic support. From there, we reviewed some of the best practices in middle school scheduling, and we compared that to our current schedule. And one of the things that our teachers noticed was that there are the best practices are very similar to a lot of the features that we have for our current schedule. So one of those features would be an extended ELA and math block. So the opportunity to provide a greater amount of instruction in those two areas. So the research supported that, and then we already had that in our schedule. In addition to that, we looked at some of the state requirements and minute calculations that we had to make sure that we abided by, so that in our new schedule we weren't violating any of our statutory requirements. After that, we looked at a variety of different schedules, just put together 5 or 6 or more schedules for our teachers to look at, and every time we did that, we ran our teachers through kind of what are the strengths and the weaknesses of each one of these schedules, and then they played with different options. So for example, one of the things that you'll notice in the Kennedy Bell schedule is there's an advisory period at the end of the day. That was selected by teachers because we offered a middle of the day time similar to the high school. We had a beginning of the day time for kids to kick off their day that way, and our teachers identified that the end of the day would be the most logical place to put it, and it would support different things that happen. So again, this is it wasn't a priority in building the schedule, but sometimes students have to leave early for track practice or track meets and things like that. If advisory is at the end of the day, that negates the implication for them missing out on core instruction or one of their elective classes because it's happening during that advisory block. In the packet, I included a copy of the current Kennedy Bell schedule, and then I also included a cleaner version of the new Kennedy Bell schedule. One of the comments that was made when we brought the schedule to the Teaching and Learning Committee the first time was that it wasn't clear where the academic blocks and where the elective blocks were, or the coordinated arts. So I tried to make that as clear as possible. The one note to all of this is 2 of the academic blocks that you'll see in the progression of schedules are allocated for math and literacy. The 3rd academic block, so it could be any one of the ones in a student's schedule, but that one would be a split block so that students would have science and social studies during that time period. So even though there's only 3 academic blocks, those academic blocks are represented by literacy, math, and then the one split block for science and social studies. So the key features of this, you'll notice, we still maintained those larger blocks of time for math and literacy. We were able to add 5 minutes for each one of those coordinated arts classes, and we have our advisory period at the end of the day for students to get extra help on their homework before they go home, ask questions about their day, or for us to include that additional programming that they might need. Questions on the Kennedy Bell schedule?
Well, thank you again for the time put into, seeing the need and then developing a plan to correct it. I thought it was curious that both we saw IDR and SAS as both a strength and a weakness in the evaluation. So I'm assuming then that the advisory period will kind of serve as, as that.
Yep.
Not needing an hour, and I do like that it's at the end of the day, because it allows students, if they are having issues, they won't feel rushed that, all of a sudden the bell rings and they're like, okay, I still don't get it. So I think that's a perfect place for it to be, in addition to, if they do have extracurricular activities that allows at the end of the day. So Yeah, again, thanks for your time put in.
Jess, would you explain or define IDR and SAS?
Yep,
Just so that people at home as well understand how that's
Yep.
being reconfigured.
Yep, SAS is a student advisory, well, it's a study hall, period. IDR, it's individual, reading that you read by yourself. We took that IDR time and put it into ELA, or into literacy time. So those people who, or those minutes that you would have reading would be spent with your reading teacher. We thought that would be more valuable.
So it doesn't necessarily cut down on the opportunity for students to engage with text. It does give us an opportunity to be flexible with a new reading curriculum in that when we talk about those extended reads, as I said before, the core of StudySync would be your literacy. That extended read, we now have an opportunity, we have additional time in literacy for students to engage with those texts. And the benefit of using one of the recommended ones by StudySync is they have guides and discussion questions and ways to support students as they read those books. So there's ways for teachers to monitor student comprehension and work on specific skills as they're doing it. So now instead of doing independent reading in the IDR time, they're doing a reading that's far more structured in literacy. And then in that SAS period where they could potentially get additional help from a teacher, that's still an opportunity at the end of the day in advisory.
So I have two questions. One's scenario and then one's a little bit more general. So advisory period. If I'm a student and I'm in my assigned class that's not science, that's not my science teacher, how does that look for the student so that he or she can visit the science teacher to be able to get the help that they need, or whatever scenario it might be?
There are different variations on how to make that work. The simplest is if the student knows that they're going to need help from their science teacher, they can ask their science teacher, hey, can I come back during advisory time for me to do this? And their science teacher can simply give them a pass so that when they report to advisory, they show their teacher their pass and then they go to that teacher. Another way to do it, we don't need to use the complex scheduling program that we have at the high school. There are online methods to do that where students can sign up to see a teacher using some of our Google products. So they can sign up to see that teacher and then there can be a limited number of slots so that we're not overwhelming one of our teachers and they have 40 kids who all need to come and see them. And hopefully if there are 40 kids who are all struggling, the teacher knows about that on the front end and then can say, hold off on the homework for tonight, we're going to go over that again tomorrow.
Right. Go ahead.
Just building
yep.
off of that. So that's the student-initiated version, right?
Yep.
Is there a teacher-initiated version?
Exactly the same thing. So if I'm a teacher, I might give students an assessment in class, or I just monitor their work and I notice that I've got a couple kids struggling. So I can have that conversation with them and say, hey, I'd like to see you during advisory today, and then I can give 3 or 4 students passes so that they can come to my room so that I can help them out on what I'm noticing. Or flip side, maybe they're not struggling, maybe they need extension, so I can notice, hey, at this point in time, you're crushing it, so I want to make sure that I'm challenging you appropriately, and then same reason I can give the student a pass and have them come into my advisory period so that I can potentially give them an extension.
My general kind of question is mentioned there were several iterations, a review had happened, pros, cons. Any challenges or potential cons to this schedule, or are they fairly minimized? Or, can you talk a little bit about that?
I think the net conclusion that the scheduling team might come to is that there's no perfect schedule that we have, and that in almost every iteration of schedules, and Jesse can jump in at any time, we noticed that there were just some challenges. When we looked, if we keep dialing it back to what are some of the themes that Jess heard when she arrived, does this schedule address those big challenges that we saw within the schedule? And it does. So we're giving more time to coordinated arts, which is a huge benefit for our kids. We're giving more time back to the core, which is a benefit for our students. we're still providing them the opportunity to engage in reading. We're just moving some of that reading time there, and we're shifting the time where students can get help from the middle of the day to the end of the day after they've had all of their classes, as opposed to the middle of the day when they may not have had, you know, homework, or they may have not wanted to let something sit until IDR or SAS because they're afraid that they're not going to get it done. So it addresses a lot of the major challenges. I think there are still some concerns that teachers have brought forward that are, some of them are structural, like there are portions of our building that because of where we've placed lunch now, they can't use necessarily the cafeteria as a gym anymore. Jess and I have just met with the physical education teachers to talk them through how can we potentially do this and still use our space effectively. And part of that's should we be using the cafeteria as a gym space? So, you know, it's one of those reorganization things of how can we think differently about what we're doing and can we still make this work? And I think for all of the challenges that were brought up to this, there are potential solutions that we have, and kind of like any program that we have, there's got to be some constant monitoring and reviewing, so that if we did get something wrong in the schedule, that if there needs to be an adjustment, that we know that we're not at a perfect spot. But one of the things that we have identified is we've addressed a lot of the big challenges that we saw within the schedule, and I think the scheduling review team, when I talk to some of the math teachers that are there, they're seeing this amount of time as this is something that's going to be a benefit to our kids. One of our 8th grade math teachers said, you know, from bell to bell, I'm flying through this with my students, and by the time that second bell hits, it feels like I haven't had enough time with my kids. This is going to give them a little bit of extra instructional time that they can work with their students. Again, when I was talking with one of the literacy teachers on the team with the prospect of getting a new reading resource, you know, that a little bit longer block that they're now going to have, and we talked about, is this something that's going to work? You know, she was absolutely on board and thought that it was going to be a huge benefit to have that additional time with kids. And then as a former science teacher who had 60 minutes to teach science to kids, I said to the scheduling team many times, I had no idea how they did it in 40 minutes. So giving, you know, our other core areas of science and social studies 5 more minutes, I think, again, is only going to aid instruction and the learning of our students.
I mean, I personally, I think there's a lot of healthy changes in this, and I think the biggest potential win from this is the fact that advisory is at the end of the day, because that gives the kids the opportunity, while it's still fresh, to address those concerns rather than wait till the next day and remember to do it the next day and those type of things. So to me, this is great, and I think it when we start the next school year, that is something that we really need to just kind of keep making people aware of. Hey, you know what, if you have a question from earlier in the day, just go talk to that teacher at the end of the day. When you go home and do your homework, you're going to be that much better off rather than currently where it's like, well, I got to remember. And then I know from personal experience there's some anxiety at home on both the student level and the parent level in trying to get the help that the student needs. And so I think that's our biggest opportunity right there, is that advisor at the end of the day.
So, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So my question would be, are the students staying at the last class that they were in, or do they go to they go back to like their home?
They'll go to a new advisory teacher. So
Okay.
we'll expand on the amount of people who can be the advisor teacher to make those advisory classes smaller.
Sure.
So they can develop that relationship and do those middle school things at the end of the day, like the parties and the
Mhm.
things that like build that fun
Right.
in addition to academics.
If a student is remaining with, so there is some prioritization that happens within advisory. So if you're a 6th grader, you're still going to be assigned to a 6th grade teacher.
Yeah.
In addition to that, if it's going to be a 6th grade core teacher, you're going to have one of your house teachers that's going to be your advisory teacher.
When I guess how would, so say a student for their advisory session would wanna stay just at the class that they're in, is there a way to kinda let the other teacher know he's not gonna be here, he's over here, so that?
Yeah,
They usually handle that by calling, if that happens, but usually it's they go to that teacher with a pass. So we instituted a hall pass system at the beginning of last year when I first got here, and that's the system that we continue to use, so it's consistent across.
sometimes it's just a quick check-in, I walk down
Yeah.
the hall and say, hey, I'm gonna go see.
Yeah, I would assume there's attendance being taken for
Yep.
the advisory,
Absolutely.
so we don't
Mhm.
have
It's a free-for-all.
wandering youth.
Yep.
Yeah, overall, I would say this schedule is gonna help. I think it's gonna be better for kids. There are concerns from staff, about how this is gonna look and, the changes that are made. And, we'll address all of those changes, but I believe overall this is what's best for our kids.
Yeah, I think, we're going from kind of a modified block to a block schedule. And I don't know if you're familiar, I'm sure you are, that block schedules don't necessarily always go over well with the parents. You have buy-in from your teachers, I'm assuming, because you've gone through this process and you vetted it and they seem to agree this is a
With
better
some,
model. And I agree it is as well. I think we have teachers at the middle school that can engage students for an hour. I don't see a problem with that. That's the important part of learning. If you're not engaged, you're not paying attention, you're not learning. So I think for me, that's not a problem, but do we have, I think, and you described it a little bit, you have some flexibility built into this. That, you know, you can do small group study and you can do different things to engage the students and you can change things around if it's not working for a student. I mean, you have all of I think you need to describe that as part of it so that you kind of negate those parent concerns, because every time a school district seems to go to a block schedule,
Right.
there's an outrage. You know, I don't want us to get 100 emails saying, what the hell are you doing? So,
Yeah, and that, you bring up a good point. That's something that we have talked about with our teachers, is how to teach within the 90-minute block. So how that makes that look with our new curriculums, that'll be very helpful. But also there's just a definite learning, engagement, teaching strategies that universally are research-based that I'm helping the staff with. So those are trainings, optional trainings that they can have from me. We ran one at our last PD meeting that they could come in. And I ran a PD in which I modeled a 90-minute lesson for the teachers. And ran
it's
it
just,
myself.
I guess what I'm getting at, it might be helpful when we approve this, if we do, that the parents get an understanding of why we're making the change. It's not just
Yeah.
a change for the sake of change, that
Mhm.
there's research, there's data, there's flexibility built in, that we have more electives, we can do, you know, all the things
Right.
that are the positives of this need to be out there so people understand.
So I'll share two concerns that I've heard in the public in the brief time this has been out here, and this is the second time we've seen a kind of a modified version of this. One was parental based. My children use IDR and SAS as ultimately extended study halls. They get their homework done in it, and they're able to have their evenings and all their extracurricular activities, and they don't feel like they're grinding away in the evenings until 9 or 10 o'clock at night. Realistic concern there, that if we go to an advisory, we still have some time, but not the same amount of time that was there before, whether that was the intended use of those two blocks or not. That's what realistically it's kind of morphed into for a lot of students. How do we address that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I would point to is, Mr. Pollock kind of alluded to it, was sometimes when we send kids home, they might not know what they're doing when they get sent home, which sometimes limits the effectiveness of homework. So if my student who goes home doesn't know how to do the homework, sometimes that just becomes a frustration point for them, and it's not productive struggle, it's just struggle. If you move some of that time that they're using for study hall, but you move it back into the core area where they're using it, so instead of giving them math homework, they might do a few extra math problems in math while their math teacher is there. So they've got additional practice with the person who's best suited to support their instruction. So it's one of those things where the amount of practice that a student's getting may not look very different but where they're doing the practice does look different. So they have more time to do the practice with the teacher versus taking it home. And that's one of those, again, that's an instructional shift that you're looking at, that in some of those, in the literacy example, and then as we talked about last year with math, when we're talking about independent practice or collaborative practice that students are doing, that's that variation of time. So they're not doing exactly the same thing for the entire time that I've got them, that I'm changing it up a little bit on them, that I'm giving them a time to do it independently, I'm giving them time to collaborate. I'm also having some time at the end of class period to pull that understanding together so that students can consolidate their understanding and they don't leave the classroom all confused because the time went by so fast that I'm lost. And that's the benefit of those 90-minute blocks that we have for math and literacy, but our shorter period classes, that's another huge piece, is you have to be flying when you've only got 40 minutes for, I mean, if you think about tech ed and just the setup, cleanup, how much time is actually allocated to me doing any piece of this. I've now given them 5 more minutes. Again, one of our elective or our coordinated arts teachers mentioned that 5 minutes can mean a significant difference. And when you tally that up across the course of a year, that's a big difference. So that, even though it looks like a small adjustment that we're putting 5 more minutes there, it does give them more time within that period to work with kids. And then in addition,
We're probably talking like close to 15, 16 hours of additional instruction time across the school year. Is that just quick math in my head?
Yep.
Does that sound about?
that sounds about right.
So I think that's a better way to look at it than 5 minutes each day, right?
Yep.
I think it makes more sense that way. And that was my general assumption, the answer I would receive on it. But that is a conversation that's occurring, and I wanted to make sure it was heard here. The second was internal on a staff side, 2:43 to 2:45. I see the additional couple minutes of the day. Two kind of questions there. How are staff feeling about that? And is it gonna change busing times, any of that on the back end? Are our kids gonna be delayed getting home? I know it's only 2 minutes, but sometimes that grows as the.
No, it will not. There are some teachers who are concerned about that 2 minutes, but generally I've heard that isn't something that they're mainly concerned about. What that 2 minutes will do will be less time standing in line waiting for the buses to come and more time just getting on less time in the bus lines. There won't, our buses should, come
So
around
the
2:48 or
totality of the day
2:49.
isn't.
No, it's still within the contracted hours.
Yeah, well, teachers, yeah,
Yep.
still
Well,
7
teachers, but I'm not saying the totality of the day for our students. We've gone down that path with alternative busing times and kind of the backup that happens throughout the night for a family
Mm.
afterwards.
It won't
But
change
that's
that
where
out. They'll
that
get home at the
scheduling
exact same
stays.
time,
What time do buses pick kids up right now?
2:48 or 2:49.
So one of the things that we have is we've got some idle time for our middle school kids, so between when they're released and when potentially their bus shows up. So,
I'm sure nothing
correct, so that's,
attractive
It
happens
just,
there.
yeah,
so,
right.
so
Right.
Jess had identified that as a potential, when we actually talked about that there was a worry that this could potentially mess with bus schedules. And we look at this as kind of an efficiency thing, that we're holding on to the students just a little bit longer, and that shortens the transition from class to bus, and then it reduces some of that idle time for students because they're getting onto their bus in a timely way.
Thank you.
I think the biggest complaint you're gonna get is from 6th graders eating lunch at 10:30.
What time do they eat now?
11:45.
Yeah, it's backing them up quite a bit.
Yeah, yeah.
It's our first lunch period at the
Unless you
high
don't eat
school.
breakfast.
Similar.
I
Yeah.
think
Our
that-
first lunch period at the high school is similar too, so it's pretty common in school districts when start times are what they are at the secondary level.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an adjustment for sure.
I don't know, last time I walked through classrooms with Jess and some other administrators doing some instructional rounds, there's a lot of kids eating goldfish throughout the day, so that was one thing we picked up on.
Yeah, maybe that'll cut down on the morning snacking and
Yeah,
they'll just
right.
hold
It
off
will.
until lunchtime.
Advisory snack, no.
Mhm. It will.
Did I hear, from a facilities use standpoint that one of the gyms is being used as a cafeteria or?
Flip-flop that.
Cafeteria being used as a gym.
Oh, okay, so is that because we need another gym? Or what's going on?
It's just different spaces to use. So we have 4 FIAT classes going on at one time and 2 gyms. So sometimes we split the gyms both in half, sometimes we go outside, sometimes we use cafeteria. If there's different units that would be better in the cafeteria, that's where we hold our space.
Okay.
It's a way to spread kids out even more than what we have.
Yep.
So for that facilities use plan, I think we gotta think about that.
See how this is all connected?
Anyone else? No? Okay, then I'll entertain a motion.
Motion to provide a positive recommendation to the full school board to approve the 24-25 Kennedy Bell schedule.
Second?
Okay, so I have a motion by Tracy and a second by Brian. Any more discussion? No? All right, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, opposed? All right, that motion carries. And we are to item 8. Motion by Brian, a second by Tracy, and we are adjourned. Oh, we'll vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye, and we are adjourned as of 6:26.
5.
6:25.